and that way I will go ahead and send out the recording tomorrow or the day after if things get a little crazy tomorrow, which they might, but you'll have that recording that you can revisit. I'll send out a follow-up as well of not just the slides, but also sort of a general outline that you can use if you want to come back and look at what we reviewed in class. So go ahead and put everybody on mute, and that's just sort of to make sure that we don't have any kind of, background noise, dinner delivery coming in, things like that. But you're welcome to take yourself off mute at any time if you end up having any questions. So, what an exciting class to join this evening, right? A class on vinification or winemaking. Sometimes I like to ask what brings people to take specific classes. Does anybody want to share in the chat? Well, here's what I always think about. I think that vinification, understanding winemaking, is something that allows us to begin to understand both our palate and the choices that are made from the vineyard to the bottle that dictate whether or not we enjoy a wine. And then also, that's a personal level too, right? If we enjoy a wine, but also why the money for that particular wine is what it is, either because it's so inexpensive or so incredibly expensive. So today we're really going to walk through the process of winemaking. Now, this is going to be kind of a high level overview. There's just simply no way we can fit in every single winemaker's decision into an hour-long talk. We won't really be talking about sparkling today. I'm drinking Paul Barra, just a glass of Paul Barra champagne. We won't be talking about sparkling or fortified wine. We'll be primarily talking about white and red wine, maybe some orange and rosé. But there are, hundreds, if not 1,000 decisions that every winemaker faces when they're making a wine. When it comes to that point that they're getting the grapes from the vineyard, whether they're estate owned and the winemaker is also a grower who works in the vineyard, which is a very common model in a lot of places in Europe, Burgundy, you even see that in places in the US, or perhaps if they are choosing to have somebody grow the grapes in the way that they prefer, and then crafting their wines from those grapes, right? But the winemakers make hundreds of decisions during this time. So what are we going to cover today? So we'll start a little bit with the concept of the grapes, right? You can't make wine, or at least the wine that we're talking about tonight, without grapes. And although we won't be covering viticulture, we do have a viticulture class recording that we did last month, which I'm happy to, last month or the month before, which I would be happy to also include with the follow-up with this recording as well. But first, we have to start with healthy grapes, right? So we have healthy grapes. They're coming from special vineyards. They might be estate. They might be vineyards that multiple producers or winemakers source grapes from. A really great example of this would be, say, Hudson Vineyard in Sonoma, right, in California. There's a lot of different producers who source grapes from Lee Hudson's vineyard, and that vineyard is really important, and you'll see that on Fela's wine, you'll see it on John Consgard's wine, you'll see that name over and over on different labels in Napa Valley because they think that these grapes are so well grown that they want to go ahead and be able to source the grapes from this grower, Lee Hudson, right? However, we'll like to say, although we're studying with great grapes, as we should be, you can really mess it up once you get those grapes into the winery. You also have to consider that the vintage variation impacts the grapes and then can therefore impact the final winemaking, right? And now most producers or winemakers will have sort of a house style that they have to adhere to if it's their brand or they're just a winemaker for another brand. And you see in this picture here, so this is Larkmead Winery in Napa Valley. At the time of this photo, as far as I know, the head winemaker here was a gentleman named Dan Petrosky, and Dan was the head winemaker for Larkmead, which is one of the oldest estates in Napa Valley. They're located on the valley floor in Calistoga. He also has his own wine brand called Massacon, in California and Napa Valley as well. And this house, Larkmead, makes, bigger, bolder Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, and his own brand is more focused on kind of the new California, higher acid, fresher picks. So he's making two different styles of wine. His own label is something different than the label that he really makes his cash cow from over here. So these winemakers really have to be careful of what's going on with every vintage, right? And so in poor vintages where, let's say, there's a lot of rain, maybe a lot of rot or mold or mildew, you still have some grape coming into the winery. So it's really the intention of the winemaker during these poor vineyards to still be able to make wine from whatever healthy fruit you can get. So usually in poor vintages where we see more inclement weather, hail, rain, we have rot, we tend to have lower yield, but a good winemaker can still make a great wine. It will just be at lower amounts. There's a Burgundy producer that I really love, Anne Perrant, and she always says that anybody can make a great wine in a great vintage, right? And this might be true. I don't know if I could definitely say that, but it is true that left alone, any fruit with fermentable sugars, if it's left in an environment where it turns to juice, will begin to ferment, right? And that's because we have yeast and we have sugar in these environments. So she said any winemaker can make a great wine in a great vintage, but it takes a truly skilled winemaker to make a great wine in a bad vintage. And she said because of that, there are no such thing as bad vintages. There are only such thing as bad winemakers. Now, these winemakers, once they've gotten their fruit into the vineyard, as I mentioned before, have these hundreds of choices that they need to make in order to produce a commercially viable wine and the house style that's meant to be. So we're choosing from the vineyard. Obviously, you're choosing things down to grape variety, you're choosing your pick times. You might pick on the earlier side if you prefer a wine that retains more acidity. You might pick on the later side if you prefer riper, more prune or raisin flavors. You might pick on the later side if you don't want green or herbaceous vegetal flavors in your wine, especially something like Cabernet Sauvignon would tend to have those grape flavors. But the riper the Cabernet is on the vine, the less of those flavors you'll have. I tend to like a little bit of that greenness in my Cabernet, but every consumer is different, right? And there are thousands of wine brands that cater to these thousands of consumers. So the producer, after they've chosen the grapes, or the grapes are at the optimal ripeness that they want, and they have a pick team to pick the grapes, they have a choice of hand harvest or machine harvesting. Hand harvest is the most gentle way to harvest your grapes. You're ensuring that you have intact berries. You can ensure that you're putting your intact berries into smaller bins. This mitigates the risk of the skin splitting open. And what you really want to do is you want to get your grapes to the winery completely intact and whole, because as soon as the inside of the grape or the pulp is exposed, then it can begin a fermentation and it begin picking up yeast from the vineyard and other things like that. So you really want to start your fermentation, your alcoholic fermentation, in a controlled environment. You don't want that starting out in the vineyard, right? So a lot of times hand harvesting is much more gentle on the grapes. It also really allows you to sort the grapes within the vineyard. Now I'll kind of jump back and forth between sort of like old world, new world styles, so that we can sort of discuss where things might be more prevalent in terms of, I mean, not necessarily in terms of hand harvesting or machine harvesting, but I'll try to kind of jump back and forth since we're doing just a broad overview of some more specific styles, right? So hand harvesting, you have a pick crew, and somewhere like the old world, it's often more common that this pick crew might be neighbors, they might be family members that come to help with the harvest. There are a lot of smaller family-owned vineyards where there's not a lot to pick. I have been a part of 2 harvests where I spent about 2 months each time at a place helping to make the wine. When I was in Germany, we hand-picked all of the grapes, and most of the people that picked grapes along with me, I had a friend who was working at the winery, which was how I ended up there. But most of the people were just college students that were just looking for a little bit of extra money and could come and help out and hang out on the weekends, right? So you're going through with a picked team. You're selecting, hopefully, the best berries that you can get. You might have gone through on a previous day and you might have taken your shears and you might have clipped out any bad fruit so that that bad fruit or those poor bunches are already on the ground. So when your pick team goes through, all that's left is healthy fruit. It's most common, and we'll get into the white wine versus red wine, but a lot of times white grapes and white grape bunches are not necessarily always sorted at the winery. A lot of times they can actually be sorted directly in the vineyard as well. And then when the grapes come into the winery, like the New World vineyard I worked at, the grape would come directly to the winery and go directly into the press. Now, when we're machine harvesting, the technology has come a long way. Even just in the past decade or a couple of decades, it can be a bit more gentle, but you don't have the same rigorous selection of healthy grapes that you do. If you want to have really healthy grapes and then machine harvest, you would have had a manual pick team go through prior and cut out any diseased or underripe or kind of uniform bunches of fruit, right? And then a mechanical, I don't think I have a picture of it here, unfortunately, but like a machine or a mechanical harvester essentially drives over the row of the grapevine. So each of the two wheels are on the opposite side of one row of a grapevine. And essentially a mechanical harvester will just shake the bushes so that the grapes will fall off of the stem. So when hand harvesting, your grapes are always on the stem when they come into the winery, and with machine harvesting they're going to be berries that have come off of the stems, right? Now with machine harvesting, because you're shaking the grapevine, you might get some other things in your grapes as well. So that could be things like leaves or stems, different things kind of falling out of the bushes. I mean, that could include, bugs and small bird nests. You see a lot of things in these grapevines. And so then if you're making a really high quality wine, you're going to need to still sort through those grapes to ensure they're healthy when they come into the winery. Machine harvesting is much faster and it's much less expensive. And in the world that we live in now with a lot of labor shortage, there's a labor shortage in winemaking in nearly every country. So machine harvesting really can allow you to pick the grapes a lot faster and get them into the winery. I mean, at the end of the day, you might be really dogmatic about hand harvesting and machine harvesting. And I really try not to be too dogmatic about anything when it comes to other people and how they make wine. Because I think that every year you have to make a series of decisions based on the conditions of that vintage in that year, and what's available to you, right? But you could be really dogmatic about one or the other, but machine harvesting is faster. And sometimes you just need to get your grapes into the winery, especially if you do have inclement weather like rain or hail coming. If you actually have a heat spike coming and the acidity in your grapes are dropping, you need to get those grapes into the winery. So sometimes machine harvesting can be the best choice for a vintage. And I always, think that I would never be so dogmatic to tell a winery or a winemaker, which is something I hear a lot of sommeliers do in New York, that they say that there's really only one way to make quality wine, and that's simply not true. And I don't think that I have the right to ever tell a winemaker who has a judicial responsibility to maybe the winery that they work for or to their own family to make these wines. I would never tell them how they have to make their wine, right? But hand harvesting is more gentle. It does allow for better selection within the vineyard. Machine harvesting is much faster, and it can also be done more at night. You can harvest hand harvest at night, it's not it's not as much fun. But it's really easy to hand harvest, machine harvest at night, especially when the temperatures are cooler. And it's best to pick the grapes when the weather is cool outside. So most hand harvesting will start very early in the morning as well. You might pick in many passes to ensure ultimate ripeness, meaning that you may go through the vineyards and pick some bunches that are at the optimal ripeness, and then come back at a later date, a week or 2 weeks later, and pick other bunches. You also see this with some styles of sweet wine, where there's actually an individual berry selection of wines that have been affected with like a kind of a noble mold or noble rot, right? And we also think about the soil too. There's an effect on the ripeness of the grapes. There's a lot of debate in wine over the discussion of minerality and can you taste the minerality, but really the soil has a big effect on the texture of the wine and also your pick times, when you will end up picking your grapes. In regions like Bordeaux, the right bank has a lot more clay. That's why you plant more, one of the reasons that you plant a lot more Merlot on the right bank, because it's early ripening, it's more vigorous, and clay soils are cooler and can slow down that ripening. On the left bank, we see more kind of gravel croups and outcroppings, and you really need these soils to reliably ripen Cabernet Sauvignon. So it has enough ripeness so that it's not perhaps underripe or green or too herbaceous, especially in a cooler year. Although we're not seeing too many of those cooler years at the moment either. Okay, so we've gotten our healthy grapes into the winery. We've decided whether we've hand-picked them, and we've decided whether we have machine harvested them. And now we need to commence the fermentation. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about red and white, or red versus white winemaking. But the concept is all wine needs to be fermented. That means that the yeast, either natural or cultivated and inoculated, need to consume the sugars in the grape juice and turn that juice into wine. I always say in my Wine 101 classes, I say, what's the difference between grape juice and wine? Well, grape juice is sweet with no alcohol, and wine is dry with alcohol, right? So what happens is that the natural juice of the grape has a lot of sugar to it. Yeast will consume that sugar and turn that sugar into alcohol. You also create carbon dioxide and heat, which we'll get to, especially for red wine making. Now, one of the choices that we need to make as a winemaker, if you are one or the winemaker there, is what type of yeast you'll be using. So this is another concept where I think oftentimes people get very dogmatic about the idea of using cultured yeast or indigenous yeast. Indigenous yeast mean that it is just the natural yeast that's in the vineyard and in the winery. Natural and ambient yeast are known to typically create a wine that tends to be a little bit more complex, but it is less predictable. So it can add more complexity and more interest to wine, but you can also result in stuck fermentation. You might not have as much of a yeast population to reliably ferment the wine within a specific period of time. I once went to a winery in the Republic of Georgia where the winemaker had red wine, Saperavi and Qvevri, that had been fermenting for 2 years. Because that's just how he just let the wine do what it does. And you think about, here we are talking about winemaking and the choices of the technology of picking with machine harvesting, right? But wine has been made for 8,000 years. We know that wine has been coming out of Georgia for more than 8,000 vintages now. So the winemaker is choosing to let the wine ferment naturally, or they might be purchasing a specific strain of yeast and using that yeast for their wines. I will say, working in wine, you do have the experience of being able to taste a lot, and you start to notice things like natural versus cultured yeast. And that is something that you can begin to pick up on. Especially there was an instance where I went to a winery over the summer, and the wines were good. They were well made, but they used the same cultured yeast for every wine. And it was like, I had whites, I had rosés, I had red wines. We probably tasted like 6 or 7 different wines. And they didn't all taste exactly the same, but they all had one note in them that was the same. And I asked the gentleman who was leading the tasting if they used a cultured yeast strain for their fermentations, and he said yes. And I'm thinking, wow, they really must use the same yeast for this fermentation, because there's no way that Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Rosé from Cabernet Franc, Mourvedre, and Cabernet or Tannat, I can't remember what the grapes were, but it was in Texas. But there's no reason that these very different grape varieties made in these different styles should all have one similar flavor. And it didn't make the wines bad. The wines were very good, but it was something that I did notice. So usually we'll take the dried yeast, we'll rehydrate it, and acclimate it to sugar. So typically what you'll do is you'll take your yeast culture, if that's what you're using, you'll mix it into a small bucket with a little bit of grape juice. That sugar, you'll allow that yeast population to multiply within that bucket with the sugar, and then you'll add that small amount of fermenting or yeasted juice back into your larger tanks with whatever you're deciding to use. You really want to keep an eye on the fermentation as it's starting. The yeast really need oxygen and nitrogen. These are B vitamins that are imperative to fermentation. Usually you get these vitamins and these minerals from the vineyard and from the soil. So nitrogen is important in the vineyard. It transfers into the winery and ensures that you have a healthy fermentation. In a native yeast ferment, sometimes you just have to be more patient. If you are using a cultured yeast strain, you can usually more or less kind of pinpoint the point that your fermentation will begin and end. But with a native ferment, you just have to wait until the yeast population builds up enough to begin that fermentation. And the actual temperature of the winery at this point is very important too. I was working in a winery in Oregon, and when we had a lot of our red wines come in and they were in bin, the fermentation was really sluggish to start because it was really cold. It was like 40, maybe 45 degrees. It was really chilly. We're in hats, like vests and coats and sweaters in the winery. And then the second week, there was a little bit of a warm streak, and it was like 60, 65 degrees. The winery had big garage doors. We opened them up, and the yeast population in these fermentation just boomed. And the fermentation just took off on all of these red wine bins. And when we get to the concept of talking about red wine, I'll talk about how you can see that. So, you can certainly make wine in a very mechanical, methodical way, but you can see and feel and hear fermentation and how healthy they are. You can also smell them, right? You monitor until you smell the fermentation, that kind of like yeasty fermenting. I don't know if anybody got into fermenting things during the pandemic. I never did, but I would watch some of these like Brad Leone videos and things like that on Bon Appetit about fermentation. I've never tried to make my own kombucha or wine or anything like that at home. I have made a little bit of bread, actually not during the pandemic, but prior to it. But you can smell that fermentation. You can smell that yeast population. You'll also notice with red wine that the cap of skins will begin to rise, and you'll see a lot of heat coming off of the fermentation too. So as I mentioned up here, not only is alcohol a byproduct of yeast consuming sugar, but carbon dioxide and heat are also a byproduct. So as we move into the fermentation, you can choose, and usually this will be chosen before the fermentation begins, but what type of vessel are you using? So sometimes this is just what's available to the winemaker. There's a lot of winemakers who are on the smaller, more artisanal side that consider that having a variety of fermentation vessels for your individual wine. Maybe you're making just Chardonnay, right? Maybe you're making just Pinot Noir. But fermenting your grapes in a range of different size and different porosity and different materials will lead to, again, a more complex wine. So you have small and large plastic bins. You might be fermenting in barrique. Barrique are the kind of normal 225 liter oak barrels that you see. You might be fermenting in a large foudre These could be used or they could be new wood, which would impart some flavor to the wine too if it's new. Very common 2,500 hectoliter stainless steel. And you see more amphora, ceramic amphora, clay amphora, cement eggs, and more. I mean, really, if you can put juice in it, you can ferment in it. The larger the area of fermenting wine, the hotter the fermentation. So something to keep in mind. So smaller vessels will have a slower, cooler fermentation, and larger vessels will have a shorter, hotter fermentation. The hotter the fermentation, the more quickly it will be completed. Now, yeast, yeast like a very small temperature window. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, so I always say that for myself. I can really only deal with a temperature range of, somewhere between like, 55 and 65 degrees. So yeast might be a little bit better with weather than I am, but they really can be active. They're the most active between 50 degrees and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we are under 50 degrees Fahrenheit, like I mentioned at the Oregon winery, the yeast are really like slow and sluggish, right? They have a really hard time multiplying. They have a really hard time consuming the sugar. And sometimes they will just genuinely under 50 degrees, they will go to sleep. They will hibernate. This is one of the things that happened in sparkling winemaking in the coves or the caves in Champagne when wines were being bottled after, remember I said earlier, you can see and you can hear and you can smell the fermentation. Well, if the yeast begin to hibernate, you're not seeing or hearing or smelling that fermentation because it's not happening anymore. Well, the wine would be bottled because the winemaker thought that the fermentation would finish. I mean, you think about all of these things like, laboratory analysis, stainless steel winemaking, temperature controlled winemaking, all of these things, right? Like these are things that are new to us within really the past 100 years, maybe a little bit longer depending on what it is. But in Champagne, the 1700s, when we were really beginning, 1800, beginning to make this kind of secondary fermentation sparkling style of wine, the winemakers didn't have these tools available for them. So the only thing that they would know about a wine finishing the fermentation was the smell, the heat, the carbon dioxide, right? So they would bottle these wines that they thought were finished fermenting. In the springtime, the temperature would rise again, the yeast would wake up. There was still sugar in the wine because it had not all been converted into alcohol. And so the yeast would start consuming the sugar again. This would create a fermentation inside the bottle. And sometimes those bottles would explode, right? Sometimes it would just create bubbles that were trapped in the bottle, carbon dioxide trapped into the liquid, like champagne. If we're over 105 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast will also just stop working. They really don't like this high temperatures. They will stop consuming the sugar. And in this case, you have what's known as a stuck fermentation, where again, you will have a style of wine where not all of the sugars have been fermented, and you might be left with some sweetness. Now, this can happen with red wines quite often. This is actually how Sutter Home's Zinfandel came about. We had a stuck fermentation, and Bob Trincaro just kind of, at the middle of the harvest season, and he just said, like, forget this barrel, this tank, I don't want to deal with it. He came back to it like after the bulk of the harvest was finished, and he tasted this wine, and because the fermentation essentially stopped, and it stopped extracting color from the red skin. So we had an dry rosé style wine that was tasted and people thought it was delicious. So this just created the kind of Sutter Home like white Zinfandel or blush craze in California in the 1980s. White wine will typically ferment at cooler temperatures. This is to preserve the fruit and the freshness. The colder the fermentation temperature, the more fresh fruit aromas of the grape that are preserved. Red wines are usually fermented at a higher temperature. So as I mentioned, they run that risk of stuck fermentation. But these hot ferments are important for extracting color, tannin, and flavor in red wines. One of the reasons for this is we'll talk about cold soak here shortly too with red, but the tannin in red wines is alcohol soluble. So you really need alcohol to begin extracting tannin from the skins in red wine. So color and tannin come from the skins of the red grape. And many of you might already be familiar with some of these ideas. And so I apologize if I end up repeating myself a few times, but just to make sure we all understand the basics of how grape juice becomes wine, right? Some other things just to be careful of. Now, this is the reason that we are going to manage the cap, especially of red wine, but also that we might be performing lab tests, checking tests on our fermenting juice, testing the tannin level, the sugar level, the speed of the fermentation, and so forth. Most wines will have a lab tech who comes around during the fermentation and checks every tank or barrel or whatever the fermentation vessel is every day. And they'll write down, they'll test things like the brix level, the sugar level, and that's just to make sure that you do have a continual fermentation, right? Some things that you might want to be careful of: sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is a natural byproduct of fermentation. It has a terrible rap, especially in the natural wine world. So you see a lot more wines these days that are made without additional sulfur added. But there is sulfur in pretty much all wine because it is a natural byproduct of fermentation. Usually wineries will add a very small amount of sulfur to the juice or the fermenting must. And this is really because sulfur is an antioxidant, and it's also antibacterial. So it will help protect your juice from both oxidation, which will take away some of that fresh fruitiness, especially important for a white wine, and bacterial contamination. So it also helps ensure that the fermentation is more rapid. You'll have to be careful of hydrogen sulfide. This is that kind of this is the more sulfuric kind of eggy aroma that you might get in wine. I mentioned before that you have to have those essential B vitamins, things like nitrogen in the must. Otherwise, you run the risk of developing hydrogen sulfide within your ferment. You also have to be careful of these sulfur treatments that are applied to the vineyard. Most wine regions have laws regarding how close to the harvest you can apply any chemicals, either synthetic or natural. So you have a lot of synthetic chemicals. You don't use synthetic chemicals in either organic or biodynamic viticulture, but you can use some natural sprays and fungicides, things like, especially like the Bordeaux mixture, copper sulfate and lime, or sulfur is really common, especially in a really wet year. Sulfur will help protect the grape when they're in the vineyard from things like mold or rot that you don't want to affect your grapes. If you have grapes that are affected by mold or rot, and you think about, I know we're talking about winemaking, but we always have to be considerate of the grower, right? Because the grower is doing their best, hopefully that's what you're paying them to do, to get you healthy grapes in the style that you want. Or if they're the winemaker, they're trying to do that for themselves, right? So if you have a really difficult vintage, you really want to get as many grapes as you can. So protecting the grape that you have with some of these treatments are really important. Acetaldehyde. This is what gives us that kind of nail polish remover. It's a sign of oxidation in the finished wine. So it formed because of a chain of intermediate compounds between the sugar and alcohol. The traces can remain in the new wine. You can manage this with, again, with sulfur, but also you can manage it with your cap management, which we'll talk about as well. And then you'll see some volatile acidity that can be an issue in wine. This is when too much acetic acid is produced by acetobacter, which is another form of bacteria. And this is the form of bacteria that converts wine into vinegar in the presence of oxygen. So keep these two things in mind for the conversation around cap management that we'll have shortly. What are some other things that we might do as winemakers to affect the finished style of the wine? Now, all these winemakers, they have a particular style, although they probably spend a lot of time experimenting within the winery too. And I always find that, I think, when I talk to winemakers, you always hear sort of the same, not always the same thing, but one of the things that I've heard is, you have winemakers that are like, I want a really small, manageable winery. We don't want to be too big. We don't want to make too many wines. And they'll make their wines that way for like 10 years. And then suddenly they're like, oh, but this year we got a little like Tempranillo from this vineyard over here. And I think that winemakers are just very naturally curious people. If you, especially in a smaller winery, you are crafting a beverage every year that is not ever going to be the same as the year before it, unless you're making a really controlled, really commercial style of wine. So what are the other things that we can do here, right? So anyways, I just think that producers really get excited about winemakers are just naturally curious people, and they just tend to like find grapes in little cool pockets of vineyards and things like that that they can experiment with. Chaptalization. This is the process of adding sugar to the fermenting must or the juice prior to the fermentation. And adding sugar does not add more sugar to the final wine. It increases the final alcohol and glycerin content on the palate. The glycerin is the body of the wine, the feel of richness on the palate. This is very common in a lot of cool climate old world regions. A lot in Germany for white wine, but even in places like, it was very common up until the 1970s in places like the Northern Rhone for Syrah. And this is because one, all of the wine regions of Europe have a minimum level of alcohol that you have to reach in order to call your wine, Chablis or Chateauneuf-du-Pape or Bordeaux, or, whichever region that you're in, what you're going to call it, they all have their own minimum alcohol level that a wine has to meet. You might not be able to necessarily meet those alcohol levels in every vintage. So chaptalization is permitted in a lot of old world cool climates. You don't see it as much as you used to. You might see de-alcoholization. This happens a lot more often now, where you might actually separate or distill part of the alcohol, especially in a red wine, and then recombine it. This was banned in the EU, but then was re-legalized in 2009. Now, this is a pretty extreme way. Most high-end producers would prefer to manage, if they can, their alcohol level in the vineyard. And what I mean by this is picking on the earlier side so that you have less sugar in the grape, which will obviously convert into less alcohol. But sometimes in specific vintages, you might need to adjust the alcohol through reverse osmosis in the winery. You do have to have a distillation license to be able to do this, however, at least in the US. I'm not sure about the EU, but you're not adjusting your alcohol by a lot. These are minor adjustments, 2% max in the EU. So we're not considering that this is how all winemakers are making their wine, but these are some adjustments that can be made if necessary. Acidification, you want to add more acidity to your wine. Common in warmer climates where perhaps you don't have a pick team that can pick your grape before the acidity is too diminished, or you might have a lower acid grape variety that you want to acidify. So usually you'll acidify with tartaric and malic acid. These are both natural acids that you find in the grape and in the resulting wine. Malic acid we'll talk about for malic fermentation. So malic acid is present in all grapes. It is the more kind of like tart, like green apple, citrus acidity. In cooler climates in the world, especially in Europe, places like Chablis or the Loire Valley, you oftentimes let white wines, or you encourage white wines to go through malolactic fermentation in order to soften those really tart malic acids into a softer lactic acid, which feels a little bit more creamy, and it doesn't have that really sharp green apple character to it. So this is why a lot of Burgundy, Chardonnay, Chablis, Champagne, oftentimes, it almost always occurs in red wine. There are very few red wines that do not go through malolactic fermentation. And even though we call it a fermentation, it's a little bit more of a conversion because it's not an alcoholic fermentation. It's the conversion. I mean, fermentation is the conversion of sugar into alcohol, right? And this is the conversion of these malic acids into these softer lactic acids. So this is what gives a lot of Chardonnay the rounder, more creamy, like slightly buttery character, because diacetyl is another byproduct of this conversion or this malolactic fermentation, which is the same aroma that you get in butter, right? That kind of buttery character that you get. The reason that this happens in almost all red wines is because if you have red wine, which also has tannin, that more bitter, astringent, drying sensation on the palate, then you'll have that doesn't go very well with the kind of like green apple tart flavors. It'll make that tannin a lot more bitter. Some examples of red wines that do not go through ML. Sometimes I've had some Beaujolais before that doesn't go through it. And I've heard, and I should confirm this, but I read years ago that Heights in Napa Valley does not put its red wine through malolactic fermentation. But I really want to confirm that with the winery directly. And that could have also been an older concept, because the yeast that really encourages malolactic fermentation wasn't really isolated until the 1950s, right? The concept of understanding the relationship completely between yeast and sugar wasn't really discovered in whole until the 1850s by Louis Pasteur. So these are pretty relatively, for an 8,000-year history of making wine, these are relatively new developments that we see here. What else can I tell you about malolactic fermentation? It usually does not occur in tandem with the alcoholic fermentation. It usually takes place after the alcoholic fermentation has completed, either in barrel or in tank, especially for red wine, because red wines are usually kept at the winery for a much longer period of time than a lot of white wines. Okay, the red wine production. So we want to keep those berries intact, right, until they get to the winery. This keeps the grapes from beginning to ferment in the vineyard. We'll harvest at night or in the morning. Keeping the fruit cold also helps to maintain its integrity. Usually we sort red grapes when they come into the vineyard, so usually on a sorting belt. A sorting belt is essentially a belt where a team of workers will sort of lean over it, and it vibrates the grapes down the belt as they go to the destemmer or their fermentation vessel, however the producer is choosing to make their wine. And this gives the workers an opportunity to select out any grapes that don't look like they'll make good wine. So this could be, I mean, and every producer makes wines differently, right? There's a big difference in how a lot of European and a lot of like US wines are made, you know, France and America, for example. Typically we'll sort out clusters and any grapes or clusters that are dimpled, anything that's raisinated, anything that's lacking color, anything that looks underripe. We'll also sort out, you know, larger stems, leaves, lots of bugs, earwigs, things like that, that you'll also find in the natural habitats of these grapevines, right? But some producers might choose to leave maybe a little bit more like raisinated or slightly underripe grapes in their production, because this could result in a more complex wine. Essentially, the more you sort your wine for the perfect berries, the fruitier style of wine you're going to have. Now, you may be selecting these grapes or these whole bunches as either whole clusters where the berries are still attached to the stem, or as only whole berries, where the berries themselves are intact, but they're no longer attached to the stem or the cluster, right? They're individual, but still whole berries. If you do want to destem your grape, they could be moved to a destemmer. A destemmer is exactly what it sounds like. Depending on what type of destemmer it is, the more modern ones are very gentle, but they just gently remove the berries from the stems. Now, some producers will choose to use the stems in the fermentation. This is common, especially for grape varieties that may not have as much tannin on their own. So Pinot Noir is a really good example. Grenache is a good example. Syrah, you often see a whole cluster fermentation as well. It lightens the color a little bit, and it also adds more kind of herbaceous, spicy flavors to the wine when you use the stem. And it adds more tannin too. So stem can be used in red wine making to build the complexity and the tannic kind of bitter profile, the fuller bodied, and thinner skin grapes that don't naturally have a lot of tannin in the skins, right? Like the ones that we just mentioned. Now, they'll usually be crushed around this point and begin to undergo the pre-fermentation maceration, things like cold soak. Not all red grapes will go through cold soak. Essentially, a cold soak after the grapes are crushed, they are kept in a very cold environment so that the fermentation will not start. And the cold soaking I mentioned before, so tannin is alcohol soluble and color is water soluble. So you can actually, if you want to, you can maybe get like 30 to 50% of the color of your finished wine by cold soaking. Usually, I mean, I would say most producers probably do it for like 24 to 48 hours, but it could be done even longer, right? But you're not really extracting any tannin from the skins of the grape, but you are extracting some color during this time. After the time is up for your cold soak, if you've chosen to do this for your grapes, you can then move your vat into a warmer environment or warm up the environment so that you can begin your alcoholic fermentation. And in red wine, maceration and fermentation occur together. They occur in tandem because we're using the water, right, the juice, to extract that color, and you're using the heat and the alcohol to extract that tannin. I hope everybody's with me here. All right, I have my my viewer turned off so I can see my screen all the way, and also I get really distracted looking at my hair. So let's talk about cap management. This is a very important part of red winemaking so that we can make sure that one, the cap just has to be submerged. So as I mentioned, the maceration, the fermentation occur in tandem with red wine. However, you know that there's heat and carbon dioxide happening with the fermentation, right? So that carbon dioxide pushes all of the berries, the skins of the grape, the seeds, and if you're using them stem, to the top of the liquid. Now, the important thing is if all of your skins are sitting on top of your juice, you're not imparting any of that color or any of that tannin. And if you're allowing your pomace, your skins, those are your skins and your stems and your seeds, to be in constant contact with oxygen on one side, then you are at more risk for some of those volatile compounds that we mentioned a little bit earlier on, like the acetobacter and things like that. So we need to manage the cap by pushing or wetting the cap so that we can see some of that permeation of the color and the tannin and the flavors of the skins and the grape in with the wine. It will dry out without any intervention. It will solidify. It will prevent extraction. And the main ways that we submerge this cap are pigage, which is essentially means punching down in French. And the photo that you have on the right-hand side here is a great example of pigage. So you're taking, this is a manual example, you're taking something that looks like a plunger, which is a very long handle, and you're physically standing on like the side of a tank or a ladder, and you're punching the cap of the skin down into the juice. This is, especially at the height of fermentation, this is hard. It's a very hard job, and it takes, sometimes you've got to put the entire weight of your body behind the plunger to initially break through that cap of skin. Now, depending on how much extraction a winemaker wants in the red wine will depend on how often you choose to punch down. At wineries where I've worked, it's usually been about 2 times a day. Punch downs will happen in the morning and at night. In the height of fermentation, if you have a lot of red wine, this means essentially you're doing this for 14 hours. There were some days, there was like maybe 2 days when I was working in Oregon that we finished morning punch down and immediately had to start evening punch down because it was just so hard. But then as the fermentation begins to come to completion, this cap begins to fall to the bottom, and you have less carbon dioxide being produced during the fermentation. The skins begin to sink to the bottom of the juice, and at the end of the fermentation, they're no longer sitting on top of the skins, right? So that's one of the ways that you can really tell that your red wine fermentation has completed, is that your cap has dropped to the bottom. You can smell it. It's not as yeasty. It's not as estery. You can taste it. If you taste the juice, it's dry. It has alcohol. You can perform lab tests on it. You can see that the wine has no sugar levels and has alcohol in it at that point. Another way to manage your cap is by remontage or pumping over. So this is a little bit more gentle. You might use this in maybe thicker skin grapes that you want less extraction with. Sometimes like Cabernet Sauvignon, it really depends on the winemaker, right? But what this will do is it will essentially is almost like a fire hose, and you stick one end of the hose into the juice. Usually you put it in like kind of like a sieve, so that way you won't suck up any of these berries. You'll only be sucking up the juice, and you pump that clean juice through the hose and you spray it over the top of your cap that you have here like a fire hose. Sometimes it has like a sprinkler attachment on the end, so it's even gentler. This can be performed, you know, once or twice a day. Usually more than twice a day is a little too much. You'll extract too much. Your wine will be too bitter. They might have too much color extraction to them. You might also see délestage, where you completely drain the fermentation vessel and then you pump the entirety of the juice back over the top. What I see most often is pigage, the pumping down. And this is oftentimes done manually in smaller wineries, but in larger, more commercial wineries, you will have mechanical punch downs as well. You might also see something like, if there's any kind of like WSET students on here, you sometimes see something called roto fermenters, which are like a stainless steel tank, but sideways. And you have all of your cap and your juice in there, and then maybe once or twice a day, it begins to roll over and kind of mixes it inside the tank. So that one's a little harsher than the pump over or the punch down, but it's oftentimes used in the much bigger wineries because it can be completely mechanized. So you may decide after your fermentation has completed to let a fuller bodied red wine continue to macerate with the skin if you want to extract any more color or any more tannin during that time. After this point, you need to drain and press your red grapes, right? So essentially, usually the cap, as I mentioned, will have fallen to the bottom. Red wine kind of naturally begins to settle itself. And you might choose to usually drain off all of your free run juice from the top of these skins at this point. And that's considered the best juice that you get. A lot of wineries will then decide that they will press the remaining solids of the red wine, the skin, the stems, the seeds, etc., to get any more of this kind of pressed juice out. And the pressed juice is usually considered to be a little bit less favorable than the free run juice. So some wineries might discard it. I mean, and like, think about, you might be like, well, who's discarding it? Like, you might be like, well, who's keeping it if it's not as good? Or like, who's discarding it? It's wine. Somebody like Harlan at $800 a bottle is discarding their pressed juice, right? Somebody who's making a delicious but kind of fresh and fruity Cabernet Sauvignon for $15 on the shelf, they're probably including some of their pressed wine back because the more wine you have to sell, the more money you can make. So usually we'll press the remaining pomace. That pomace, or excuse me, that pressed juice will usually be blended back in a small amount with the free run juice. So we might see a basket press. This is something like you would see in champagne, but much larger. This is obviously a very small kind of like hand basket press. I mean, you would use this almost for like ice wine or something. My aunt has one of these. We use it to press apples and make cider. Sometimes when I go home during the fall or holiday months. So most wines are pressed in a pneumatic press today. So a pneumatic press is essentially a bladder press. There's a rubber bladder inside. You load your grapes into your press, you expand the bladder that's in the side, and it pushes the juice, squeezes the juice out of the skin through these smaller drainage channels. High quality reds are usually matured in oak barrels. You can determine the size and percentage of your new barrels. It's determined by the style of the wine that you want to produce, and also the amount of money that your winery has to put behind aging, because the longer you age your wine, the longer it is until you get money back for all of the investment that you've already made, right? You've already planted your vineyard, You've waited for those grapes to mature in the vineyard for at least 6 years, if not more. You've already paid your vineyard workers, you paid your pick crew, you have your winery space, you bought your new barrels. Now you've got to age your red wine in your barrels for 12 to 24 months. You're not seeing any return on your investment until that wine hits the market. So places like Bordeaux or Napa. This is also why it's common to see in a lot of wine growing regions kind of younger one producer who releases several ranges of wine, right? And those younger, fresher wines, Rosso di Montalcino versus Brunello di Montalcino, gives those wineries some cash flow while they're aging their Brunello for 6 or more years, right? 5, 6, sometimes even longer. Same thing with rosé winemaking. You're making rosé wine from red grapes with a shorter maceration than for your red wine, but it also, rosé wines are usually released, one of the first releases from a winery. So you can go from your picking to bottling for a rosé wine. I mean, you can do it within weeks. Think about Beaujolais Nouveau. Beaujolais Nouveau is bottled within weeks of the harvest. Like, that's a fast turnaround, right? You guys want to make money in the wine business? Make Beaujolais Nouveau. That's how you're going to make money, because you just the quickest return on your investment when you're making those wines. After your reds are in barrel, sorry, I'm getting off topic. You are going to rack your wine periodically. So racking the wines, the movement of the wine helps with the aeration and the clarification, and it removes the wine from the lees or the sediment. Now, red wines, more or less, kind of naturally fine or filter themselves, because as they're in these barrels and racked and returned over the year or more that they're in barrel, all of those sort of gross and fine lees settle to the bottom of the barrel. The lees are the little bits of like leftover grape skin and pomace and things like that. And the wine comes off the top pretty naturally clear and clean. But you still might decide to fine or filter your wine. This is another hot topic in winemaking. We don't have too much longer, so I just looked at my clock. Probably about another 5 or 10 minutes at the most, but if you need to jump off, I understand. So fining and filtering, you've already racked and returned your wines. You're going to rack them a final time. You can choose to filter your wine because filtering promotes stability. You filter your wine through a series of membranes or pads with microscopic openings that can remove any excess grape matter, particulates, yeast in the wine. You might decide to fine your wine, which is where you're adding something that coagulates any leftover, again, grape matter, yeast, lees, anything like that you might find in the wine. Bentonite, casein, isinglass, gelatin, and egg white are all very common for fining. We use egg white more for red wine, as it doesn't tend to, these will strip wines of color too, especially bentonite, casein, and isinglass. So these are usually used only for white wine, maybe for rosé. Egg white is used more often for red wine. However, if you are looking for a vegan wine, you're not using isinglass or egg white or gelatin, right? So casein is more of like a protein. So I don't know if you could use that either. You can use bentonite to fine or filter a wine. And you don't have to fine and filter your wine, because there's a lot of school of thought and a lot of producers who think that fining and filtering at all, while it removes the more kind of cloudy appearance of a wine, that it will also strip the wine of some of its character. So natural fining or filtration, like in red wine, sometimes it's preferred, and some people just choose not to fine or filter their wine at all, and they don't care if it's maybe a little bit cloudy or turbid or slightly hazy, rather than a really clean, fresh, especially white wine, because they are not usually kept in barrel or tank and racked and returned nearly as often as something like a red wine. This is Bodega Chacra. Coming from Patagonia. They make terrific Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. They make Malbec too, but I've never had it actually. I've just the Pinot and the Chardonnay. This is a winery that is run, and the wine is made by Piero Antinori. He is the nephew of the gentleman who started Sassicaia. So another important, he just fell in love with Pinot Noir from Patagonia, went down there to make a wine. Carbonic maceration can also be used in red winemaking. This is where you take your whole clusters, you seal them in an inert environment without oxygen, and they begin an intercellular fermentation. This intercellular fermentation only happens in this anaerobic environment without oxygen. It causes the berries to essentially split and the juice to run out. It's used more often in Beaujolais. After 2 or 3 weeks, when those berries have split and the juices run out, the juice is then drained from the tank and you have a regular alcoholic fermentation. But because you have a lighter color, not as much skin contact with the juice, you have this flavor in the wine that's less tannic, it's more fruity, and people say it kind of has these flavors of like fresh, like cherries and kirsch and a little bit of banana. You can also do semi-carbonic maceration where the tank won't be sealed, but the bottom berries will have a little bit of this carbonic maceration. And anytime a wine, I've been told, and I've heard other people disagree with this, but anytime a wine is made with whole cluster with the stem, I've been told by some winemakers that there's always a little bit of carbonic maceration that happens. So you might get that in blind tasting a lot in something like Beaujolais Nouveau, but you might get a little bit in like a whole cluster Pinot Noir coming from Burgundy. Okay, white wine production. So white wines are not made with the skins of the grape. If you take a white grape and you make it with the skins, it becomes an orange wine. A white wine that's fermented with the skins, and just like red wine, gains a little bit of color and tannin. It doesn't become red because the skins are green or yellow, but it will gain that kind of orangish hue to it. And you will get more of a tannin on the palate that drinks, I always say, a little bit like iced tea, right? That really like light tannic character that you get to the wine. So in white wine production, I mentioned before, you oftentimes will just load your grape directly into the press when the white grapes are coming into the winery. They're usually crushed and pressed, or I say usually, they're always, unless you're making orange wine, crushed and pressed prior to fermentation. So where red wines ferment with the skins and then are pressed, white wines are crushed and pressed, and then the juice ferments away from the skins of the grape. They can be destemmed and crushed, or you can put the whole bunches into the tank. That really is both a stylistic consideration, but also a time consideration. So the stems provide better drainage channel when you're crushing and pressing your wine. However, you can load more grapes that are single berries rather than whole bunches into a press. So if you're a really big winery and you're getting your fruit, you can't really stop when you have to pick your grape, you can't really stop it when it's coming into the winery. So there will be some days, like if you're working on a press, I mean, you might work 16, 18, 20 hours because you just cannot stop until once the grapes come in, you can't stop until they're in their right place. So the harvest is very fast and furious in a lot of ways. So if you're a bigger winery and your space for pressing is limited, you'll probably destem your grapes first because you can fit more grapes into your press. And press cycles take a long time, especially most grapes are pressed in a cycle. Like these pneumatic presses will come with, you can have them sort of set up for the style of wine that you want to make and the pressing you want to make, but usually they have a series of settings that you can use on them. But these grapes aren't just quickly pressed all at once. It's a gentle pressing that usually takes several hours. And after you've actually pressed your grape, you then have to dig out the press, right? Because you've got your juice off, but now your press is left with all of these stems and or skin, right? So I should say skins and or stem. So you then have to dig out and clean your press before you can even load it again to start pressing again. So the process of one press is at a minimum usually 2 hours, and that's a fast press. Most grapes are probably going to be pressed gently for a period of like 2 to 3 hours before even having to dig them out, with draining the tank and then digging it out. So you might see traditional or modern presses. Some white wines can see a very brief period of skin contact for a few hours. Usually this is not a long enough period that it gains any color or tannin, but it can gain some additional complexity from the skins of the grape. The first press is always the highest quality. The juice is allowed to settle. In the winery with white wines, it's really important to cold stabilize your wine. So tartrate or tartaric acid will form in wine when the wine gets cold. So if you've ever seen in red or white wine, those little something in the bottom of your glass or your bottle or your glass or your bottle that almost look like shards of glass or like little crystal, that's just the natural type of acidity that's in your wine. But most wineries, because most guests kind of like freak out, or most consumers that don't understand what that is will be like, oh my gosh, there's like glass or salt or something in my wine, sugar, something like that, crystals in my wine. In the wine world, when you want to be kind of funny about it, we call them like wine diamonds. But a lot of wineries will cold stabilize their wines, their white wines at the winery, so that those crystals precipitate out at the winery instead of after the wines are bottled. But some winemakers choose not to do that. I think it's more common that old world wineries don't cold stabilize their wines. A lot of wines cold stabilize themselves because if they're kept in the cellar in these cooler climates over the winter, that tartaric acid will precipitate out of the wine as it is. Light aromatic whites are bottled pretty shortly after the fermentation. They're not aged in barrel if they don't undergo malolactic fermentation. Good examples would be Sauvignon Blanc, I think is the best example, right? We drink Sauvignon Blanc, we love those herbaceous, fresh, fruit-forward aromas and flavors. We might arrest the fermentation for white wine that we want the residual sugar to remain. And then we also have to filter the wine. So if you have like a Riesling or a Chenin Blanc, something where you do want to leave some of the natural sugar in the wine, and we're leaving natural sugar, we're not adding sugar to the wine. So Riesling is really high in acidity. And so sometimes we leave a little bit of sugar because it helps us make the wine more palatable and balance the acidity. So sometimes I say to people, leaving sugar in Riesling is not usually about making it sweet. It's usually about making it balanced. Both of the wineries that I did harvest at were really prolific Riesling producers. And so that natural sugar that comes from the juice that just left in the wine, meaning they stop the fermentation so that that natural sugar stays in the wine. And then they will usually filter the wine because you have to make sure, and I think I have it, I have it one more step down here. You have to make sure that these wines that have sugar left in them purposefully are filtered, and you filter out any additional yeast so that a fermentation won't reoccur in the bottle. If you have a fermentation that reoccurs in the bottle of your white wine, it becomes fizzy. It might be a little bit sparkling, but mostly it will, not usually the bottle will explode, but it will usually pop the cork out. And we had this happen at the winery. One of the interns that I worked with, he had gone to school in Eugene, which was pretty close, and he said, oh, I'm going to go down there for the weekend and come back on his days off. And he took a bottle of wine with him that had recently been made, and it was like a Magnum. And he thought, he came back, he's like, gosh, I took an empty bottle of wine with me. I don't know what was wrong, but we realized that these wines were re-fermenting. So probably like somewhere at one point in like his trunk or something, like it just got shook up from driving in the car, and the cork popped out, and the wine he just lost the whole thing. And he was always like, what happened to the wine? He's like, I thought I put a bottle of wine in here, but there was nothing in it. So we think that's what happened. You might also have white wines that are matured in oak. A lot of wines that are matured in oak will undergo a full or partial malolactic fermentation. The winemaker, just like they can control how much oak they add to a wine, can also control that malolactic fermentation. So the malolactic conversion really prefers a certain temperature and a certain sort of a strain of yeast or enzyme that will help encourage that malolactic fermentation. So winemakers can adjust it in those ways. Usually, if white wines are in barrels, they'll be bottled after 9 to 18 months, especially wines like Burgundy or Sauvignon Blanc Semillon blend coming from the Grape in Bordeaux. And you might see that lees impact or batonnage, where you take your white wine when it's in barrel and tank, and you stir it with a little bit of that sediment that's still left in there after the winemaking. And that lees and that sediment will expand the texture and the richness of the wine. So you see that a lot in things like Chardonnay that are a little bit more on the neutral side. Why is oak so important? This is really the last slide we're talking about. So oak It's watertight, it's lightweight, it's malleable. It became the vessel of choice as far back as ancient Rome. It allowed for a very gentle, slow oxidation of the wine, and it helped to round out and soften the texture. Smaller oak barrels like barrique lend more effect than larger oak barrels. New oak will contribute both flavor and even more wood tannin on the palate. Oak become neutral over time. So by the 4th or 6th year of use, an oak barrel can still be used for the fermentation, for the oxidative effect, but it will no longer impart that oak flavor. If anybody here is a bourbon fan, that's oak flavor, right? Not the strength of the bourbon, but that kind of like cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, vanilla, coconut, sweet baking spice that we get in some styles of wine that's coming from oak. That's not coming from the grape itself. You can use less expensive oak alternatives like oak chips or staves, oak powder. They don't provide the oxidative effect. If you've ever had like one of those, like $6, $8 really oaky Chardonnays from the supermarket, and it just feels like you were slapped in the face by a 2x4. I mean, that probably wasn't made in an oak barrel. That was made with like oak powder or something like that. And that's why it feels so unintegrated into the wine. A wine that's aged in oak will feel much more, in an oak barrel, will feel much more integrated, but oak barrels are very expensive. They're also very difficult to clean. They're much harder to clean than, for example, stainless steel. Even like things like cement or plastic bins are really, cement's not as easy to clean, but like stainless steel, plastic bins, really easy to clean. Things like cement, amphora, and barrels are much harder to clean. But they also begin to kind of develop almost their own terroir as well, right? Which is really interesting. You might see micro-oxygenation. This is an aeration technique where small amounts of oxygen are allowed to enter a stainless steel tank during fermentation or maturation. This is really common for really big, bold, tannic styles of red wine that they want to soften a little bit sooner. It was a technique that was developed in a region called Mataron for a grape variety known as Tannat in southern France, but it was really adopted by Michel Rolland for all of his kind of like his flying winemaker trials of softening a lot of these red styles of wine around the world. Michel Rolland has done a lot of really wonderful things for the wine world. Some people do argue that he's kind of led to a little bit of the homogenization, I guess, of wine, because you have hundreds of wineries all over the world consulting with like one major winemaker. So it's kind of driving some of those styles to be a little bit more similar. What else can I tell you about oak? The level of toast and the type of wood change the flavor that's imparted. French oak has a tighter grain. It's developed through a slower growth. The staves are split rather than sawn. This helps prevent leakage. It is air dried, and it has a much more gentle process to extract the tannins. American oak has a wider grain. It grows faster. We use it for, of course, bourbon production. It gets sent to Rioja. In Spain, after it's been used, it is less porous. It can be sawn. It has more vanilla and lactone, coconut, and dill flavors. And it can be kiln dried. It's oftentimes air dried as well, which it should say here. I guess it does. So many American coopers are now air drying. It takes a long time to do this. Once you have your oak staved, you're usually air drying them for anywhere between 2 to 5 years before you're even making your barrels out of them. There are 3 stages of making your barrel. First, you have to warm the wood, then you shape it, and then you finally toast it. All of these, the warming and the shaping can be done with fire, or they can be done with like things like steam or heat. But your final toasting, where you decide on your light, medium, or heavy toast, is really where you determine how much of that new oak flavor will really be imparted into the wine, or into something like the bourbon in that case. So I'll send out these slides. So I don't think we need to go through all of the different oak forests and the standard sizes of oak that you see. Of course, there are other styles of oak like Hungarian, Slovenian oak. In somewhere like America, it was really common in the early days of American winemaking to use other barrels, things like chestnut or redwood. Chestnut barrels are often really common in Italy as well, especially for more traditional styles of winemaking or more historic winemaking. So it's not always only about oak. There are other types of wood that are used, but oftentimes we see it done with oak. The very last thing you're going to do, you're going to blend and you're going to rack and you're going to bottle. Once your bottle of wine is all ready, it's going to go into the bottle. You're going to create the last of your blend. You'll homogenize them in large tanks, and then you'll send them into the bottle. Some wineries have their own bottling facility, and other wineries will have a bottling line that comes in somewhere like smaller producers in places like Oregon or so might actually have a traveling bottling line that you as a winery have to book for a certain time, and that traveling bottling line will come into your driveway of your winery. They'll set up their bottling line and they'll bottle your wine for you. You probably have to do this a few times a year because most likely you're going to be bottling your white wines in the spring, and then you might be bottling your red wine the following spring or summer. So it really just depends on the style of wine you're making. So sorry to keep you over. That was a really quick, rapid introduction to winemaking. So I hope that you, I hope that made sense. I think that's all I can really say. So there's a lot of decisions that go into making wine, obviously. As I mentioned before, I don't think we can as wine consumers, I think that we need to be educated so we know why we like certain wines based on their winemaking and grape growing. But I also think we can't be so dogmatic that we will only drink or try one style of wine or one style of winemaking. And of course that we are purchasing wines that are ethically and consciously made. So I just think it's lots of fun. Anyways, if you have any questions, you can let me know. Otherwise, you can send me an email. You have my email already from the video link. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon. I'll send out a copy of the recording and the slides. You'll have those soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks.